We will talk about a resume of the theories in second language acquisition and learning. Now we have the introduction to first language acquisition and its implications. And first language acquisition refers to the first language we start to be in constant exposure from the moment we're born. And it is also called mother tongue or native tongue. The implications are that in first language and second language acquisition, there are theories which try to explain how language acquisition and learning happens. Although the theories provide vast explanations and research, there is no concrete answer to how humans process language. Now we have the differences between first language and second language acquisition. And in first language, we have that is an instinct triggered by birth. It's very rapid, complete in terms of full or close mastery achievement, and it's natural. It can be acquired with no direct instruction, while in second language acquisition, it occurs by personal choice and it requires motivation. It is also stational and not as quick as first language acquisition, and it's learned by steps and leveling. It's never as good as a native speaker, however, good competence can be achieved. And natural is possible, but guided is more recommendable. Now we will talk about the theories, and I will talk about the behaviorist perspective. Adriana will talk about the Ignatius perspective, and Ivania and Aldair will talk about the cognitive perspective. And the principles of the behaviorist perspective in second language acquisition and second language learning are repetition, imitation, reinforcement, praising or punishing for correct habit formation, and are based principally on Skinner's and Pavlov's animal experimenting. Both believe that all behaviors are based on stimulus and conditioning to produce an outcome. Furthermore, Nelson Brooks and Robert Lado proposed techniques which were later used in the autolingual method. And with this method, teachers are the model and act like an orchestra leader, directing and controlling students' learning behaviors. And students' learning process occurs through imitation and repetition. And with this method, all these activities emphasize mimicry and, of course, memorization, because pupils learn new vocabulary and structural patterns that are presented through dialogues that are memorized. In addition, Pavlov used to experiment with animals to show learning through association, and one of the classic experiments was the one in which Pavlov used the dogs for showing how learning can occur, and he presented food to the dogs so that they salivate, and then he used a bell to call the dogs and give them food. The dogs associated the sound of the bell with the food, and whenever Pavlov made the bell sound, the dog started drooling, even if he didn't have a piece of meat with him. That's why opponents say that humans cannot be compared to animals, and therefore they shouldn't be objects of similar experiments, like the one which was made with a baby and rats. Finally, we have the contrastive analysis hypothesis, which states that if the first language and the target language are similar, students will not face problems and they will acquire second language with ease. However, where there are differences, students are expected to make mistakes or transfer their first language bad habits to the new language, which has been completely denied by other researchers because learner mistakes are not predictable on the basis of their first language.
The Ignatius perspective. This theory is based on Chomsky's universal grammar theory, which states that all children or adult learners will be able to grasp the grammar of the language they are surrounded by. It states that humans are biologically programmed to language functions. This means that all humans come with a specific module in our brains that will help us develop language. Learners will only need opportunities to allow development, since we already have the skills in our brains. We just need some guidance or tutoring or exposure for us to develop the language skills. However, the Ignatius perspective does not offer a good explanation of how language works in different ages, especially for those students who start learning a language after the critical period hypothesis, which is the hypothesis that states that all those learners who start learning a language after puberty will not acquire the language as in a native, like pronunciation or master. Overgeneralization. This picture basically represents the overgeneralization that happens with universal grammar theory, that all learners believe that all patterns should be put into practice in every single function of the language. In the Ignatius perspective, there are some theories that say that instructions and feedback do not really affect how the process of language really works or occurs. They say that interaction and availability to language in the learner's environment is the one that really affects, since they believe that we have a specific module in our brain. So it's basically the tutors or the teacher's guidance, the one that helps us develop the language skills. The previous sentences leads us to the Krashen's models, or the 5 hypotheses that he tried to implement with the Ignatius perspective. The first one is acquisition versus learning. He says that acquiring and learning are two different things. Acquiring is gathered from the context, and learning is consciously picking up the language. For example, we acquire a word in a movie or probably in a book, and we try to implement it in our normal communication. But probably we do not understand that word really clearly. So learning will take the place. It will be the consciously picking up the language. It means that if we do not understand a word, we consciously go or voluntarily we go to the dictionary to find out what the word means. And then since we stick it up in our brains, we are learning it because we are conscious about it. We are conscious about the actions of taking a dictionary and paying attention to the meaning. Then the monitor hypothesis, it's when students draw the acquired and engage in spontaneous communication. Students polish the acquired and are concerned about producing correct language. So this is basically related to what I was saying first in the acquisition versus learning. We gather a word or language function that we liked, and we try to implement that word or language function to our normal or spontaneous speech. We try to use it with our friends or with the teacher, and as we go by, we try to make our communication a lot more fluent or more correct. Then the natural order hypothesis is basically that the acquisition of the second language happens in predictable sequences, just like in the first language acquisition, that we learn pronouns, nouns, verbs, negation, questioning in the same order. It's the theory. And then the comprehensible input hypothesis, which says that exposure to comprehensible language material or material of the same level or one step ahead, that we basically have to be conscious that every learner has steps or has levels of proficiency in the language. For example, if it is impossible for a teacher to provide information or material of a level 5 student to a level 1 student, because obviously the level 1 will not understand the language that is being used in a material from a level 5. Then the affective filter hypothesis, it says that students do not necessarily acquire comprehensible input successfully if they have psychological barriers. This might be problems or concerns. Probably the student is very sad, has problems at his home, and therefore will not be paying attention as he should in the classroom. So it does not matter how easy the teacher is trying to make the class. If he has any problems, or if he feels bad, or if he's too happy, then the affective filter says that depending on the emotions that the student feels, that will affect the implementing of the class implementing. It will affect. If he's too happy, then he will be hyperactive, and if he's too sad, then he will be a lot more passive in the classroom, and therefore the learning process will differ.
Cognitive perspective for learning emphasizes the importance of cognitive for human development and behavior. There are two elements of the cognitive perspective: the behaviorism, which is basically influenced by external events, and the cognitive view, which is an extension of understanding already acquired. The cognitive and developmental psychologists argue that there is no need to hypothesize that humans have language a specific model in brain, or that acquisition and learning are distinct mental processes. Use the computer as a metaphor for the mind, comparing language acquisition to the capacities of computer for storing, integrating, and retrieving information. With the cognitive perspective, we have information processing, which is the change of information in any manner detectable by an observer. It's an approach to the goal of understanding human thinking in relation to how they process the same kind of information as a computer, building knowledge that will later be used automatically, and in the practice involves cognitive effort on the part of the learner, but it need not necessarily be available for the learner's introspection. It can occur below the level of awareness. So, through experience and practice, information that was new becomes easier to process, and the learners becomes able to access it quickly and even automatically. Connectionism is an approach that hopes to explain mental phenomena. Learners gradually build up their knowledge of the language through exposure to the thousands of instances of the linguistic features. Learning mechanism simulated by a computer program can not only learn what it hears, but can also generalize, even making overgeneralization mistakes. The competition model is defined as an explanation through both L1 and L2 acquisition that takes into account not only language form, but language meaning and language use. Has been developed into a unified of first and second language acquisition. In second language acquisition requires that learners learn the relative importance of the different cues appropriate in the language they are learning. And we also have second language application, interacting, noticing, and processing. Interaction hypothesis claims that comprehensible input is important for language learning. Researchers argue that conversational interaction is essential for second language acquisition. Michael Long argued that modified interaction is the necessary mechanism for making language comprehensible. And Mary Swain extended this thinking, and she proposed the comprehensible output hypothesis.
The nonsense hypothesis. So, Richard Smith proposed suggesting that nothing is learned unless it has been noticed. Smith hypothesized that second language learners could not begin to acquire a language feature until they had become aware of it in the input. Also, Susan Cass described a learning process that begins when the learners notice something that is different from their knowledge of the language. Um, I could say that the notice hypothesis helps students to learn language with strategies that include their interests. So they can notice and pay attention to all the details when they are reading a book or listening to music. Also, the noticing hypothesis helps teachers to motivate learners outside the classroom because the student continues reading or watching television. after classes. So in this way, learning process does not end.
Input processing. Um, Bandfed presents the most complete model of input. The role of working memory is important in this model since some of the principles are predicted on a limited capacity for processing. The principles are learners process input for meaning before they process it or from. The second is for learners to process work that is not meaningful. They must be able to process informational or communicative content at not cost to attention. And the third one is learners possess a default strategy that assigns a role of agent in the first noun they encounter in a sentences. So, one further argued that the problem arose in part from the fact that learners have limited processing capacity and cannot pay attention to form and meaning at the same time. Also, he developed instructional processes that require learners to focus on the language itself in order to interpret the meaning.
Processibility theory. Harrell and Manfred Pittman conclude that the sequence of development for feature and syntax and morphologic was affected by how easy these were to process. Easy of processing was found to depend to a large extent the position of this feature in the sentences. Features that typically occurred at the beginning or end of the sentences were easier to process than those in the middle. All learners acquired the feature in the same sequences, even though they process at a different rate. Uh, Pittman argued that one important aspect of his theory is to integrate integration of developmental sequences with the first language influence. He argues that his theory explained why learners do not simply transfer features from their first language. Instead, they have to develop a certain level of processing capacity in the second language before they can use their knowledge of their feature already exists in their first language.
The sociocultural perspective. So Vygotsky's theory proposed that language development takes place in social interaction between individuals. So it means that learning it's occurs when an individual interacts with interlocutor with his or her own proximal developments. So when we are talking about the SPD is the difference between what a learner can do without help and what he or she can do with help. Um, the some proximal development is a metaphorical location in which learners co-construct knowledge in collaboration with an interlocutor. So in this case, the all two learners advance to higher level of linguistic knowledge when they interact with knowledgeable speakers.
The differences between some proximal development and crushes is these two concepts differ in relations to their view of how development occurs. For example, crushes, it's about the comprehensibility of the input. That's say that development occurs from outside the learners. On the other hand, the sound proximal development it's a metaphorical situation in which learners can contract knowledge in collaboration with other people.
In conclusion, all these theories don't explain exactly how humans learn a language. However, we can take a look at humans' learning process with the explanations provided before in the theories. Moreover, what influences learning the most are students' characteristics and the techniques implemented by the teachers to enhance their learning opportunities and their learning process.